I'm presenting already the panelists that we're having here, starting with Sally Burge, who is one of the long-standing activists and digital rights activists based in Ecuador and executive director of the Agencia Latinoamericana de Información, ALAI. And she's all over the internet as well, written extensively on the net and digital rights. She's been working since the 90s on digital issues and was responsible for the creation of the first electronic mail node for the Ecuadorian network Equanex. I don't even know what an electronic mail node is. So anyhow, it sounds good. You have as well led an initiative for the Association for Progressive Communications on encouraging women to use the internet already a long time ago at the 4th International Women's Conference of the UN. So a long history and a strong presence. Then we have as a second speaker here, Probirpo Cayasta. And I went online and I tried to find your bio, where it says that you're founding editor of newsclick.in, a digital media platform, and an activist for science and the free software movement. And I think that's one of the most gross understatements that I've seen so far online. Bobby is definitely as well that, but he is an authority on digital rights, digital campaigning, but not only on many other rights and issues as well. And among others, has been one of the people that first have taken up the call for a military embargo on Israel years ago in India and promoted an effective campaign to actually block for a few years one of the key arms deals between Israel and India. Then we have Norman Chamas. He is as well a decade-old activist and educator, and focuses on human-centered information and digital security and privacy. Norman, you're joining us from the belly of the beast from the US, and you have been working a lot on security issues, and are at the moment the director of the Open Privacy Research Society, have been working with Article 9 and many other organizations and networks. There is as well with us Alison Carmel, and last but not least, because your contribution will be key, as International Relations Coordinator of Hamle, which is a Palestinian digital rights organization. Your history in in digital rights in the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa region, is as well long-standing. And the campaigning that Hamle has done over the last years to bring the issue of Palestinian rights and Israeli violations of digital rights has been absolutely key. Now we can start the event, and with a big thank you to all of you that have joined us here. I hope that everybody has the translation that needs it. This is the third seminar in a number of seminars for World Without Walls that we are holding this November. And World Without Walls is an initiative that was actually born exactly 4 years ago in the aftermath of Trump's victory, that was based on his electoral campaign promise to build a big, fat, beautiful wall. So that triggered really a common call from Palestine to Mexico to the rest of the world to fight those walls, and not those walls only, but many others. And in a very short time, over 400 organizations and movements from across the globe endorsed that call. And in fact, what happened after 2002, when Israel started building its apartheid wall in the West Bank, is that literally a boom for wall building started. And now we have over 70 walls on borders in occupied territories across the world. And instead of tearing down Israel's apartheid wall, the powers that are have legitimized that wall building and made it somehow a political fashion or a symbol of the racist far right that shares evidently with Israel the same values of apartheid, of supremacy and repression. And that spans from Modi's India to Latin America's Bolsonaro, to Trump, the European far right, and so on. Now that Trump is gone, the walls remain, as well because Trump wasn't the one to start building the walls, neither in the US nor anywhere else. But I guess it's a moment where we can say, let's take that as a chance and an opportunity to see that as a beginning of the end of the walls, if we give everything we have in our struggles. But World Without Walls was never only about physical cement infrastructure. It was really about the myriad of ideological, systemic, legal, and economic tools that the oppressor uses to bar access to justice. We've chosen to have one of the webinars of discussing walls during this month of webinars to discuss digital walls. And they have become ever more important in our reality, especially today with the COVID crisis, where more and more of our life moves to the digital sphere. But the question that we want to ask here and have asked ourselves, what exactly are digital walls? How do they work? And what impacts do they have on our lives? And Israel or Israeli apartheid and Palestine activism, what do they have to do with it? We know that Israel's high-tech companies and their technology, and much of that technology is based on Israel's military capacity and military research and tested on Palestinians first, exported later, are looking for ever new markets. Just recently, Israel's defense ministry has issued a tender to survey new export opportunities of Israel's cyber technology in the post-COVID world. They are predicting more markets as protests rise due to crisis. But what role does Israel and its technology have in that digital world? And what role can Palestine solidarity have in strengthening the broader struggle for digital rights and freedoms? And I'm happy to have this amazing set of speakers here with me today to discuss some of these issues and help us to think how we can build effective strategies and effective campaigning. We will have 2 rounds of interventions first. First, looking a bit more at where we are at the reality, and then a bit what can we do to change it, and then open up for questions and answers. And at this stage, I would really just like to ask Sally Burge to start up and open up with her intervention on what is the digital world, the digital walls today.
Okay, hello everyone. And thank you for this invitation to be part of an initiative around such an important issue as a world without walls. Can you hear me okay? Is the sound good? Yes, good. I think the main contradiction we're facing today in the world is the one between transnational financial and corporate power and the peoples of the world. Even in the case of local or national conflicts, most often transnational power is one of the key factors behind those struggles. We just need to think about the role arms manufacturers play in stimulating wars or the interest for natural resources of our countries. In the case of the digital domain, where national borders are almost invisible and an international regulatory framework is seriously lacking, transnational power is even more central. And yet it's really identified as a major issue for social struggle. I think this is a serious error because increasingly our lives, our economies, our media, our jobs, even our social struggles themselves are taking place in the digital realm, and much more so since the pandemic started. And the great majority of these interactions take place on platforms and with software that are controlled by a few of the most powerful corporations in the world, what we sometimes know as the GAFAM: Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft. So why should we be concerned about this, and what can we do? Internet was developed as an essentially decentralized space in its origins. It allowed people to create their own online spaces. It facilitated free sharing of information, exchange, etc. It's true it was much less massive at that time. Not that many people had access. So when private enterprise saw it as a new opportunity for business, the problem they faced was how to make money out of something that was essentially for free. That's when Google stepped in, and early in this century created its particular business model, followed shortly by Facebook, which basically meant turning data into a source of income, mainly through targeted advertising. They soon realized the data they were collecting to improve their services wasn't enough, so they started to map out our entire lives and societies, and to provide a constant stimuli to us so that as users, we'd continue to provide more and more data on a daily basis. In fact, the next step is going to be not just what we do, what we communicate, it's going to be to map out our bodies and even our minds. This isn't science fiction because enormous investments are already taking place on how to do this. It's what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, which she's analyzed in detail in her book on the subject. And she demonstrates how we're being forced to render all the details of our existence, most often without even knowing it. With the Internet of Things, this is going to be a lot worse. There'll be no private spaces. And all of this is for the profit of others. We sell predictions of our future behavior to their real clients, which are the businesses and governments that pay for it, so that they can have greater certainty for their investment and their planning. They then found that a further step, which is more effective, is to influence and mold their behavior to conform with their goals. So they're not just predicting what we'll do, they're influencing what we're going to do. A simple example is incentives like motivating people to put a like on a tweet or Facebook. But then it moves on to things like influencing decisions, how we vote, stimulating peer pressure, particularly among young people who are more vulnerable to peer pressure. And if necessary, coercion. For example, if you don't conform, you're going to lose out. So we're kept in a constant cycle where we feel we have to be permanently attached to our mobile phone. We have to use the big tech platforms rather than alternatives so that we continue feeding in our data hour after hour. So this invasion of intimacy, if we think it's something that's exceptional, scandals have come out from time to time, like Cambridge Analytica or the Snowden revelations that made us think maybe this is an exception, occasional excesses. It isn't. It's the inexorable internal logic of the system they've built. They have to extract ever more data, but they keep their plans secret because they're publicly unacceptable. And when resistance arises, they develop deliberate strategies to neutralize it. For example, generating a sense of inevitability. Well, it's the price we have to pay to use the service, and so on. And they find ways to make the abuse seem normal, generating resignation. Just to give an example, many people's organizations don't think twice about doing their organizing, strategy making, dissemination in privately controlled spaces like Facebook or Gmail, which is something we'd never accepted in the physical domain, to move our strategizing and our organizing into a private domain controlled by a multinational corporation. And another take on this issue, if we're looking at it from a global south perspective, is that any advances in affirming national sovereignty and autonomy from the global powers that countries may have achieved are now being undermined by a new form of intervention, which we could call digital colonialism. For example, many of the free trade agreements signed in recent years or in negotiation include clauses that stipulate the free flow of digital information. That might sound inoffensive. In practice, what it means is that freedom of the freedom of the big tech companies to remove data, which is their source of wealth, from its place of origin, and store and process it into artificial intelligence in countries where we have no legal recourse to control how it's used. They're taking this further in the World Trade Organization, where they're trying to put forward e-commerce negotiations to make these rules generalized across the world. And this means that our countries would then be, it would be impossible for them to regulate how data is used and to stipulate, for example, that it has to be stored nationally. It also means that the artificial intelligence, which is a new source of power, remains under the control of these companies, which then sell it back to us under their own terms. And if we consider that what's known as Industry 4.0, the new digital economy is going to be taking over quite fast, I think, from the physical economy in a large number of areas. It means that our countries are going to be once again in total disadvantage, faced with the few countries that control the technology. So digital colonization could leave countries of the South in a situation of dependence comparable to that of previous centuries, or maybe even deeper, because it's entrenched in our personal lives. Previously, the open veins of our countries were the railways and shipping lines that sapped the mineral and agricultural wealth of our economies. Today, it's the submarine cables and satellite connections that are bleeding our countries of data that are later sold back to us as artificial intelligence. But curiously, data as an economic resource isn't even yet on the agenda of multilateral discussion. The digital economy has imposed surveillance capital as the dominant model while keeping its main source of profit, data, practically invisible. So what does this mean for social struggles? The digital domain is increasingly where we discover new ideas, where we strategize, where narratives are imposed, where meaning is disputed, where our arguments and struggles win or lose legitimacy. In other words, it's a site of cultural struggle, which is the basis for any transformation, any fundamental transformation of our societies. And this has increased exponentially with the pandemic, as have the profits of the big tech corporations. So in that sense, while there are far more important social struggles than taking back control of the internet, such as food, health, climate change, we might see that the fight to regain control of the internet is perhaps the most foundational struggle, because it's where all our other struggles are taking place, or most of them. So I think it's something that we need to take on as political and social movements as a fundamental issue that we need to work on collectively, because it's a global issue. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Sally. That was another dramatic reminder of how much this digital sphere is entering all our spheres and parts of life. And I'm particularly fond of remembering that today it is the platforms that have substituted the railways. And Prabir, I'm looking forward to your contribution on the digital walls today.
Well, one of the advantages of speaking after Sally is that she has already covered most of what I would have liked to say. So I can be much more focused on only specific elements of it, because she's given us the big picture. I think there are two things that I will just in passing touch upon. One of it is that when we talk about finance capital, we must also now understand that what are being called the tech monopolies, they are in fact a different kind of force than the original neoliberal forces that led to financialization of the world. So it is in that sense different from finance capital. And each of this GAFA, whatever you want to call it, the Google, Amazon, Facebook, etc., there are about 5 or 6 of them. So if you take all of them put together, they have different kinds of business strategies, and they actually inhabit different areas. What I'm going to speak up on today is really more about what I call the social media platforms, which is Google and Facebook, who earn their basic revenue not from selling data, but collecting data, understanding us better, and selling us as eyeballs to advertisers. So that's really where they're taking over. In fact, most of the company's profits, because if you don't reach if the advertisement doesn't reach the people, then of course people can't sell or companies can't sell. Therefore, a large part of the surplus of manufacturing companies are being handed over to Googles and Facebooks so that they can access the markets better, because what I used to say, and I think is still very true, that Google and Facebook knows us better than our mothers. So given the way they know us, therefore selling goods becomes easier. When we talk about the walls that Maren started with, it's important to having gone to Palestine, having seen physical walls, spent 1 year in jail during Mrs. Gandhi's emergency. So I do look at walls in the physical sense, not only in the sense of an imagery, that physically walls restrict you, you can't go out, you can't meet people, you can't talk to people, and so on. So when you talk about digital walls, that doesn't seem to be true. You still can talk across the wall, so to say. At least you have the illusion that you are talking to people, you have freedom, you can approach them, you have personal friends and relations in different parts of the world which you are approaching through the electronic medium. So what are then these digital walls that we're talking about? So I think it's important to understand the digital walls function in 2 ways. One is it shapes your reality. In the physical walls, of course, the reality is just cut off. You can't see most of it. You have a very small restricted space that you're in. Here, it creates a reality for you, which it pretends is the real world, but which it is not. It is, in fact, the reality the digital platforms are creating. this is not just the digital platforms, it's also the kind of power that, for instance, the empire, the US and its allies have in creating a history, creating a reality, creating what is quote unquote normal. This is what history is. This is what the reality is, to the extent that we call it the Middle East. Now, from where is it Middle East? After all, if we take where the Eurasian mass of people live, which is about probably 80% of the people, no, it's not east from us. It's only east from Western Europe and the United States. So even our geography is conditioned by what they tell us is the real world. Now, this is one part of it. How do you look at reality itself? The second part of it is that if you are observed, if you are in what was called by Bentham as the Panopticon, where the prisoner is watched all the time by the guards, even if he does not see the guard, but he knows that he's being watched, his behavior changed. And Bentham's concept of the Panopticon was how to change people's behavior. And this is the second part of what the surveillance capitalism, which Sally talked about, does to us, that it actually shapes us in a way that we change. We are observed, we change our views, we censor ourselves, we don't do a certain set of things. We can be named, jailed, prosecuted, but also shamed. All of this is also the way people can condition to react in a certain way. I'm going to leave that part of the physical surveillance state out of my talk, because that's something, given the fact that I'm now 73 years old, I think this is something which belongs to much younger activists than me. So I will come to what is the way the wall really reflects reality. These digital platforms, how do they react reality? And I'll give a simple example. This is, of course, Karl Rove's, supposedly Karl Rove's, we don't know, but a very senior advisor to George Bush was supposed to have said that we are an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you are studying the reality, judiciously, as you will act again, creating another new reality. What he's asserting is that we have the power now as empire to create what reality is. It doesn't depend on what you think it is. We create that reality for you. And when I was looking at a simple historical fact, that who fought the Second World War, who defeated Nazi Germany, that just after the war, in France, 57% of the people thought it was Soviet Union. Today, 58% of the people, this poll has been done, it's been done every 10 years. Today, the French people believe it is the United States who defeated Nazi Germany. So I think the number of people who died from the United States in that war was something like 400,000, against something like 27 million of people, 27 million who died in Soviet Union. So given this 60 years gap, history has been now rewritten. And that is the accepted history. If you don't accept it, well, you are somebody who's a revisionist historian who's trying to create something which is not really history. Of course, as Palestinian activists, us, we know that apartheid of state of Israel is something you can't say. If you do it, then you will be called anti-Semitic. Of course, we are relatively free from that because we never really oppressed the Jewish people, unlike the Europeans, or what would be the Christian Europeans. But if you want to criticize Israel, then in large parts of the West, and I'm using the West again with quotes because it is not really West on a globe. So this is that then you are anti-Semitic, you are siding with completely retrogressive forces, you are racist, and Jeremy Corbyn, of course, who's fought for the rights of the Palestinian people, is now within the Labour Party being suspended for being anti-Semitic. Now, this is a travesty of truth. Now, this is the reality which can be created. And let's face it, social media is an extremely important part of the reality which is being created. Now, this was earlier done by Hollywood. It was done by Western media agencies. Today, social media has become an extremely potent force in all of this. And what Google and Facebook creates, and I'm going to differentiate both of them, they create a reality for the rest of the world. Let's look at Google, for instance. Google search tells us what facts are, what history is. If it doesn't come on the first page of a Google search, probably 80–85% people do not go beyond the first page of a search. So effectively, Google tells us what is reality, what is history. And Google's views might appear to be neutral. It is not, because after all, the algorithms are written by people. And Google was funded by the United States military. That's how the origin of Google is. It has been supported with the full knowledge that these are instruments of power, and therefore they should be helped to create the Western view of reality or the US view of reality of the rest of the world. So Google search engines may appear to be neutral. They are not. I'm not going to go into details of this, but the point is Google's argument that algorithms are neutral has been shown to be false number of times. In fact, of course, one of the classic failures of Google is when it identified black faces as gorillas. That was the image recognition software they had. If you put a picture, it would identify what the object is, and it identified human beings, if the color was black, as gorillas. Now, that is not an accident, because who programs this so-called artificial intelligence? Artificial intelligence is built by human beings. Let's not think it's something outside us. So this is the part how even today, how racist Google's algorithms are. There have been tons of research on this. You can read it up, that how it dehumanizes black populations, how its search is tailored to a certain view of the world, and so on. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but the reality is Google's views through its search, which is a very potent instrument of knowledge for us, effectively is reflective of the pathologies of the world we have today. Secondly, we come to Facebook, and Facebook has become even more important because it has been recognized as the key purveyor of fake news and hate propaganda in the world. In different countries, whether the United States or Europe or India, it has been implicated in fomenting hatred and giving a platform, bringing together people who have a hate agenda, bringing them together. In fact, I think one internal research said that in Germany, 64% of the far right had come to know each other only because of Facebook, because the algorithms put them in touch with each other. Now, why is it so? Because Facebook needs eyeballs, just as Google needs eyeballs, and it is the eyeballs it sells. It's our attention that it sells to the advertisers. And hate is a very potent means of capturing eyeballs, capturing human attention. So hate propagates faster in social media than real news. These are well-known research results which exist, and Facebook's algorithms reflect that. So it is not surprising whether it's India, whether it's the United States, whether it's Germany, and of course, whether it's Israel, that Facebook has been a partner and a potent partner of the far right as well of the state. It's been its attack on left resistance in Palestine, in different parts of the world, aligning with the right is not an accident, because the right really propagates hate. The left tries to attempt to essentially the rational part of human beings. We believe human beings are rational. So therefore, we appeal to their rationality, what we think is justice. While the right is much more simple. It says, that those kind of people, they're animals. We just need to oppress them. So white supremacy on the net is not a surprise, particularly in the social media of the Facebook variety. So the question, I'm going to leave this as my last contribution. The question is, what do we do? We cannot walk out of the social media because that is a place of struggle. We cannot vacate any place of struggle today. So we have to be there. But at the same time, when we are there, we have to understand the limitations, that this is not going to be a fair fight with both sides being guided by an umpire of what the rules are. The rules are skewed against us. The question is, how do you fight a guerrilla war? And I'm saying guerrilla war is not what you're fighting with guns in this case. By using your intelligence, how do you fight this guerrilla war against what is oppression within Facebook? And the second part of it is what Sally has also talked about, that you have to also talk about how this power of the platforms need to be limited. That how do you have to break them up, or what the JustNet coalition in which Sally and we are both there, what it has propagated, that these are essentially public platforms and they should be used for the service of the public. And therefore, they should be either regulated or they should be taken over and serve the cause of the needs of the people. They provide public good in a way that others cannot do. And therefore, they need to be either regulated or should be taken over by the people. I'm not saying that it's just being taken over by the state, but taken over by the people is something we need to explore as an idea. How do we make that happen? I'm going to leave this here, but this is not a struggle of Palestine alone. This is not a struggle for Palestine alone. It's a struggle against global capital, against imperialism, against the empire. And currently it's a struggle against white supremacy. It's a struggle of religious identity politics, neo-fascists like Modi in India, like Bolsonaro in Brazil, and so on. So I'm going to leave this here, and I'm with you in whatever struggles we want to do against digital walls, as also against the physical walls that exist in a number of these countries.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for that amazing explanation of a take on what other people told me. The most important thing about walls are the gates, where they control you and how they actually control and manipulate you. And before we're moving over to Norman, because we are already waging our guerrilla war against Zoom, not accepting Linux, and are working to ensure that one can do interpretation as well with Linux computers. Here, a big thank you, first of all, to Eric and the Itzatskun that are doing the translation to Spanish to us. And we're shifting over now to Itzatskun as well in the interpretation. And I hope that is working now when Norman is starting to give his intervention now. If not, we'll shift over to Eric again.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Sally and Prabir. This has been really great as a starting point. There's so much to cover potentially, so I'm gonna try and be quick so that way we can leave more for discussion and conversations. I wanna perhaps just start with this idea that Sally had started to talk about, which is the decentralized idea of the internet. And even though the internet perhaps was started decentralized, it was never decolonial. And it was never meant to be an anti-colonial tool. The internet started as a military information sharing network. And the technology itself was very much designed with English language and at its core. So even though the things that we even take for granted, or when we think about how the internet and technology shapes what we're talking about, as Prabir was noting, the fact that we, for example, utilize primarily Latin characters or English characters and terms and words is already part of this larger problem. And what we saw, for example, in some of the early days of the internet was the creation of a new market in China that the US market wasn't covering. And because of, again, the way that capitalism and markets worked and the desire to, or the lack of market in China and the lack of need for actually building out infrastructure and websites for the Chinese population, because it wasn't improving the US companies, it has sort of led to like sort of a separation and really created the groundwork for something like the Great Firewall of China to be created, because China is able to have its own services that have been created. And this model is starting to be proliferated, and it's what you see in places like Iran as well, or Cuba, where this decentralization is both sort of a positive and a negative thing, where we've now created sort of multiple sort of internets and sort of these information bubbles. And I want to sort of start with that idea, because when we're thinking about what is or who controls the internet, in some ways, we have like a panel around internet governance, but there are all of these things that are external to that. And the corporations like Google and Facebook and Microsoft are playing a very large role in all of this. And we've sort of moved into this economy of trust, where we trust the platforms with our data. And that becomes a key part of then how we sort of shape and design things. So I start there because when we think about security and privacy, there are some very clear indications where trust and these platforms provide positive alternatives. The internet was not created with security in mind, and there's a lot of information that is presented through some of the basic infrastructure. The DNS, or domain name system, has been a very big aspect of that, where you're able to view the websites that people go to, even when some of the content is protected. And people have started to do things like take advantage of this, and there are movements to protect this a bit better. And as this happens, places like China and Russia are also trying to block some of these technologies. And because of this larger design within internet governance and this control that has been based around European and US interests primarily, there has been an erasure of some of these concerns that come up for folks outside of the US and Europe. And so these companies have come in, and they've also then provided additional protection, because in order to implement some of the security mechanisms like transport layer security, or HTTPS, which is one of the most important elements that a website can provide to help protect its users' privacy and what they're going to, what they're looking at, again, sort of government surveillance, you have to rely on people with money and with resources to build that out. And so we're in this unfortunate situation where corporate trust is something that is there. And when we're thinking about alternatives that we need to build, we need to also think about alternatives that provide this security and privacy. And that is one of the big issues that I really think is there. And with Israel in particular, Israel was on the cutting edge of some of the move towards what we talk about like cyber warfare. So not only has the digital space become a place of sort of capitalism and consumerism, but it has become another place of geopolitics and international conflict. Israel and the US are largely thought to be the ones who started some of this cyber warfare with the Stuxnet virus. And the Stuxnet virus was created to cripple Iran's nuclear centrifuges. And it was designed and built in a very sophisticated way that has now sort of shifted. And you're seeing a model of other governments start to look at how we can utilize the technology to essentially break into it and break the technology. And one of the things that Stuxnet built off of are what we talk about as O days or 0 days. So undisclosed exploits that allow someone to gain further access. And so all of this comes down to, in some ways, this sort of question of security, because as the internet has developed and as cyber warfare has moved online, we're at the point where companies and corporations want to protect their information. We have governments that are controlling information, such as 0 days, and even independent researchers that act as sort of, we'll say, digital mercenaries that find these exploits and sell them to the highest bidder. So again, when we're thinking about these, what can be done in these alternatives, this becomes a really important element. And I don't want to spend too much time on some of this because it can get quite heavy. And I'd rather focus on some of what we know in terms of like what's going on, some of the things about like regulation around some of these dual use technologies, which we actually have a little bit of control over, and we're seeing some positive movement. With the creation of the data economy and the information economy as we have, newer regulations around privacy have come up, and GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation out of Europe, is the one that has probably been the most effective and has gotten some of the most press. And GDPR in particular is even shifting how we think about things like data transfers. And these sort of mechanisms around privacy and regulation are proving to at least have some sophistication that can push back on the platforms to some degree. But we really are relying on the US to push back on the platforms because of the legal frameworks that govern business. But what GDPR has done sort of more recently, there was a case in July, or decision, I should say, by the chief courts of the EU around GDPR and data transfers called Schrems 2. And what this case did is it indicated that when data transfers from Europe to other companies are happening, we need to start thinking about national security. We need to start thinking about the surveillance mechanisms that can occur and how to ensure that those rights exist. And so what has happened is, in essence, this question that wasn't fully invalidated. People can send data between the EU and the US right now, but there are these questions of what does this do to the global economy? And in essence, there's also this question of how does national security outside of the US also affect EU citizens? And Israel was one of the countries that first started coming up because of their known information security and their security mechanism with surveillance. So we have some of these sort of tools and regulations that can be used, at least in theory, that we're starting to see developed. And we are seeing some positivities in some ways that these legal frameworks can push back on what Israel is potentially doing from the EU perspective. And these changes that we're seeing within these regulations are affecting the platforms in general. And the platforms are providing more control for people to protect and how they use their data. But again, this still comes back to trust. And what we really need is we need to be thinking about infrastructure, we'll say creating infrastructure that can move away from this sort of trust model. And this is still a newer area with technology that is sort of being developed and sort of thought through. And we don't really have good ideas, but when we're thinking about how can we decouple, we'll say Palestine and the Palestinian data from some of these colonial mechanisms, is moving away again from this trust model and this reliance on these corporations. So within the larger way that surveillance also works is it utilizes and works off of how companies and networks do their own security. As Prabir had mentioned, there are these notions of defining what is normal, which is a key part of how sort of security works. We have what we talk about as firewalls to build a particular network or protect a particular network. And there's data monitoring within that defines what is normal information, what isn't normal, to identify potential threats or potential concerns. And this is the same sort of technology that national states use for surveillance. And it's where things like artificial intelligence are working, and algorithms are also being designed to determine what is considered abnormal within technology. And some of the other methods that use is when you find that there is an issue, you move towards things like what we talk about as digital forensics. You look at all of the logs, you look at the data to try to determine what went wrong. And these tools come in the form of, again, artificial intelligence and software platforms that can extract data. And Israel is becoming one of the leaders in that space. There's a company called Celebrite that is an Israeli company that focuses and is based on mobile technology and mobile forensics. They sell software to both corporations as well as to governments and law enforcement. So this is what we're thinking of, and we talk about as sort of this dual use technology. It has these sort of, we'll say, theoretically approved or positive uses, such as, again, helping corporations understand what's going on, as well as, again, being used as weapons themselves. And one of the big issues when we start to think about, again, sort of spaces where we need to be looking at information, or when we need to be looking at protections or what can happen, is the lack of regulation for some of these tools. Celebrite very famously worked with the FBI to unlock information from an iPhone with the San Bernardino shooter, but they've also sold their tools to governments like Venezuela. They've also sold their tools to governments like Indonesia, and they even advertise their tools as being able to extract information from all of these personal data sources like Grindr or OkCupid and other dating apps. So we're at this crux, this crossroads, where the question of technology and what can be done when we think about how do we push back on this, where we're caught with, again, a lot of dual use technologies, where we're caught between how do we think about and push back on companies that sell a product that's used by corporations and enrich or help out in these ways, but also are selling it to governments. And so that's, I think, a very important distinction, but recognizing that the methods are the same, that what we're using in corporations are also being used at the national level and vice versa. So we have a larger problem at hand, but this problem comes and exists because we're not thinking of technology as a regulated space, that we're thinking of it as a private space. And again, that's part of what leads to the creation and the use of all of these sort of, information bubbles, or all of these different aspects where companies and private companies can sort of control this new form of colonialism that exists based upon this infrastructure. So let's see. I think with that might be just a quick introduction and a place just to stop, and then we can sort of talk a bit more during the discussion, as like because there's a lot there in terms of dual use technology, in terms of how the security mechanism exists in sort of some of these regulations.
Thanks a lot for that overview of contracts and opportunities. And I think it's now that we're literally zooming in on Palestine for Alison to give us an idea on how really Israeli technology is involved in that framework, and what does it mean for Palestinians? Because we're not talking in an airless space, but on effects on real human beings.
I'm Alison Carmel. I'm the International Relations Manager at Hamle. So Hamle is a Palestinian digital rights organization, and my work is primarily focused on digital rights of Palestinians, both in Palestine, but also oftentimes our work goes beyond to look at those in the diaspora who are working on issues related to Palestine and defending of Palestinian human rights. You who maybe don't have as much intense knowledge of digital rights, The rights that we look at a lot of time when it comes to digital rights are the right to access the internet, the right to freedom of expression, the right to data protection and privacy, assembly and association. And for Palestinians, these rights have been targeted for decades as a part of Israel's colonialism and apartheid policies, but in particular, this has been moved to the online sphere in the past 10 to 20 years, as other speakers were sharing that, cyber war has become more of a way to be conducting war, and also it has been a way to conduct what we call the digital occupation. So this digital occupation starts right at the ability to access the internet. The entire ICT infrastructure of Palestinians is controlled by Israel. So in fact, there is no safe way to access nor the internet or telecommunications. Everything is passing through Israel and is being surveyed by Israel. This we have found out in the past year as the response to the coronavirus has been in place. We've also seen more open sharing of the level of surveillance, about the level of surveillance that Israel has been conducting. And in March of this year, the Shin Bet revealed to the public that they had been surveying all Israeli citizens, not just Palestinians, who use any of the Israeli SIM cards and cellular devices, all of their communications, and that they have this massive database. So in addition to having the data, they've also been working to develop the legislative background and legislations that would be needed to further the control of data and usage. And particularly of importance is a legislation which is currently stalled, but we know has actually been put into practice already, which is related to the development of the Cyber Directorate in the Prime Minister's office. So this broadens the power of the existing Cyber Directorate, which was created in 2011. Ministers circumvent all legal proceedings under the pretext of fighting cyber crimes. It will also compile all of the data from many different sectors, so health, education, security, policing. All of this will be compiled into one database where employees will be hired in secret and accessible to the Prime Minister and whoever else he or she would deem. This is very concerning, as I will get to further, because of who has been hired to create this Cyber Directorate. And from our understanding, that most recently has been quite a notorious Israeli company called NSO Group, which I'll go into more details about later. We also have the Facebook bill, which has been hanging around for quite some time, and it's an attempt by Israel to be able to give the police the authority to remove content online and to fine Facebook very high fines if they do not comply with Israel's requests, either for the private data of people or for removing content and accounts. Okay. I'm going to continue to do just a little bit of focus on what's happened since the coronavirus, because I think we started to see more things. The Israeli Secret Service has been using geolocation tracking, as we also have seen with many other countries increasingly. And they have a mobile phone device that is used to spy on and trace Israelis that have been diagnosed with coronavirus, or who may have been in contact with people who have coronavirus. And actually, just in the past few days, most of the West Bank has been locked off from Israel, and any Palestinian citizens of Israel who were in the West Bank now are required to be in quarantine, and their phones are potentially being tracked as a part of this contact tracing. And this did go to the Supreme Court, whether this was a violation of people's privacy, and the Supreme Court ruled actually that this program can continue. And then we have Hamagen, which was a voluntary tracking app designed by the Ministry of Health. It was supposed to be an alternative to the other app designed by the Shin Bet, but again, once they went to the Supreme Court ruled actually it's better to have the Shin Bet's application, so the voluntary app was pushed aside. We also have Hawkeye, which is a set of smart cameras that detect license plates and has been deployed throughout the country more intensively in the past year. It's also includes documentation of keeping information, which there's no reason to keep the information of the car. And again, this information goes back to that cyber directorate, as we were saying, which gives kind of this total control to the Prime Minister's office. And of course to the Shin Bet and other Israeli apparatuses. We also have Al-Munassak, which is the coordinator, and this was required by the Coordination of Government Affairs in the Occupied Territories, which is essentially the Israeli coordination office, and which holds the kind of administrative aspects of the occupation. So, for example, if you need a permission, if you need a birth certificate, if you need a passport, you're going to be interacting either directly or indirectly with COGAT. And now to be able to receive permissions for work or other things, there was an application developed, which we did a technological deep dive into and found was taking a lot of information from people's phones, access to their photographs, to their videos, far beyond what any kind of application like this would necessarily need. And but we do have to mention a small success, which we found after some pressure also at the governmental level, that they changed or appear to have changed the way the app is functioning now. And then I just wanted to move on briefly. This is a bit of a past presentation, and we've been rapidly moving these days, so I haven't had time to add Celebrite, but I do want to call a lot of attention to that organization, just as Norman did. And I really think, like, in the what to do conversation, this company is one to really keep in our attention. But you know, in the past year, a lot of the work was talked about around NSO Group. Probably many of you remember the killing of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who was a Saudi journalist in Turkey and killed in the embassy there. And his device had spyware called Pegasus, which is actually from NSO Group, who has a new name once again, and I don't remember the new name now. But they're always changing names, hiring expensive PR companies, and most recently, the Israeli government helped them and hired them both to develop the health data system as well as this National Cyber Directorate. And they are one of these notorious dual-use companies, which we were just talking, which Norman was just talking about, and I'm sure we will discuss further. And then, of course, there is AnyVision, which was quite a bit in the headlines last year, as this company was invested in by Microsoft, and the company developed a lot of its technology using the facial data of Palestinians to create its facial recognition technology through its contracts with the IDF. And after some public campaigning, some high-level journalists, some high-level media pressure, and pressure from civil society, Microsoft did actually decide to do a human rights audit into the organization and ended up divesting, although they claimed that there wasn't any human rights violations. They decided not only to divest from AnyVision, but from any secondary companies that were working on facial recognition technology, and just to work on their own. And I think what's important, just briefly, I want to mention something that I think maybe has just lightly been touched on, but I also think is really important, has to do with the investors and the investment companies and the supply chain process for the investment in these types of companies. And I think there's work for us also to be doing there, to be learning, to be informing, and to be monitoring these investment companies, because oftentimes we actually are finding through our network of researchers working on this, that the human rights due diligence that these investment companies are supposed to be doing is not being done. And not only that, they're using false and misleading information, which has been often fed to them through disinformation campaigns by Israel and by Israel supporting NGOs, to draw conclusions that are based on, to draw conclusions to invest in a company that is violating human rights. So I think also we have to think beyond the state actors, beyond the surveillance companies. We need to think about the supply chain relationship, and the investors as well as an important part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a lot of information in a short time. And I hope you will be giving us that PowerPoint so that we can share it with all those that have participated here and registered for the webinar. Now we're starting the question and answer session. As said, considering the time constraints we're having, I'll mix my own questions with the questions from the audience. And there were a couple of questions, and one was directly to Prabir about the contract you've been struggling against in India. And I would add to that one as well a question on what do you think do we need to do when struggling for Palestinian rights or against Israel's interests in the digital sphere in order to ensure that we are actually contributing to the much bigger struggle that you and Sally have proposed and presented us in an effective way, so that we really can promote Palestinian rights and digital rights at the same time? That's a big question, but maybe you can find in a few minutes a couple of points that make us think.
I'm not going to get into a long answer because it's just impossible to answer this second question that you've really asked. Yes, the arms deals were the ones that we took up, Barak missile deals, because there were proof or at least evidence of corruption in this. This is also came up in Israeli courts that these deals had various money which changed hands with essentially corruption, obviously of Indian officials. So including one minister was in fact charged with it. So all of this is in public domain. But unfortunately, there is quote unquote bipartisan support between the main opposition party, the Congress, as well as the right-wing BJP party, which is particularly favorable to Israel, as we know. Israel has also sold its hacking software. In fact, Pegasus, that it was just referred to in Khashoggi's murder, in the assassination. The NSO is the company which sells the software, has been used against Indian activists and to hack their homes. So Israel, of course, is presented as this really fantastic software, hardware company which does all of this. Let us recognize Israel has also been chosen for that role by the United States. So a lot of the things the US cannot do domestically, it wants the Israeli agencies to do even in the United States. So therefore, a lot of this alliance between particularly UK, United States and Israel is so that they can spy on each other's citizens and share the information, which under domestic laws they may have some problems. Of course, Israel doesn't really have this problem, but US has. It's not supposed to spy on its own citizens. So it's asked the Israelis or the British to spy on its citizens, in which case they're protected. They have just got the information from friendly spy agencies. Okay, now this is a part of the larger game that is there. But Israel is deeply embedded in the US empire infrastructure. So that's really a part of it. You talked about how do we fight all of this. I think there are different ways that we have to fight. The Panopticon, which is what I talked about, is what they have created because we willingly click yes to anything that we go to on the website. Says, can you put in cookies? We say yes. because we want to serve that site. When we open we download any application, it asks us, please go through all my documents and then say yes. Now, those documents are 7,000 to 8,000 words. Nobody reads them. Average time which we click yes is 6 seconds. So this is not informed consent. So this is one part of it. So we have to fight it on the realm of law. There is no other way that we can fight this. It is not through individual action we can win these battles. And the important part, or the good part, is these issues of monopoly and the violation of democracy is coming up in different places. The good part of the world as of now is even a Trump administration filed cases against Google. Okay, Elizabeth Warren says that they should be broken up. So you seem to see from very different political standpoints, the threat of digital monopolies is being perceived. And I think that is the one which has to come up much more. Fighting the state and intelligence agencies is a much longer fight. And unfortunately, it is something that people of my age are incapable of doing. So we really require younger people to tell us how to do all of this.
Thanks a lot. And I see here quite a few questions for Alison. One is in particular about the burn phones to protect your identity and whether they are available in Palestine. Then there is my question together with that. What are you actually doing? What are the actual struggles you are planning in the future, how we can work with? And I think one thing that I think is important is how does it affect Palestinians? How does it feel in the Palestinian reality to live with such kind of surveillance structures?
Yeah, so a lot of Hamla's work has been about conducting research into the digital rights environment and how violations of digital rights is impacting the Palestinian population. Particularly, we have a number of these researches available on our website, both in English and Arabic. And particularly, you see women and youth targeted heavily and suffering a lot from both arrests related or from gender-based violence online. And slowly, essentially what we've seen is that they've stopped their political engagements. 3 out of 4 Palestinian youth do not feel safe to express themselves politically online, according to our research. And instead, they prefer platforms like Snapchat, TikTok, Instagram, where it's not really about politics and where it's not text-based. A lot of the danger for them really resides, as they see it, mostly on Facebook. And most all Palestinians know someone who has been arrested because of something that they posted online. So we're really living in an environment where the way that we behave is dramatically changed because of the ongoing rights violations. The surveillance technologies and the details of the surveillance technologies are still really not clear enough, both to civil society activists and quote unquote experts like myself, but also to the general public. And we worked a bit last year to bring light to the issue of facial recognition technology. And eventually it became very clear because it started to be apparent everywhere that you go in Palestine now. Many more cameras and the digitalization of the checkpoints. So, but surveillance has been something that Palestinians have dealt with for a long time. And so in a way, it also does create a challenge for especially now with the health issue, to help people understand that there are ways that you can keep yourself at least a bit safer. But the truth is, in general, the environment is very unsafe. So a burner phone, I don't really know how useful it is because all the SIM cards and all the telecoms companies are surveyed. So it's not really that useful. I'm not a digital security expert, though we have experts within our organization. And I'm sure that there may be alternatives and different ways of accessing the internet or accessing telecommunications. But as Prabir said earlier, you know, Palestinians are still on Facebook. Palestinians are still in social media networks and in where the general public still is accessing and interacting with the internet. So while there is a conversation that's important about developing the alternatives, we are, as an organization, still focusing on the places where most of the people are, because we're a human rights serving organization. But we do think that over time, you know, these alternatives will be increasingly important, and that we hope to see a more diffuse digital space that isn't so concentrated with so much power right now. I do want to say it's really important that we are doing more research and mapping of these actors, of the surveillance technologies, of the type of technologies that they're using, who's invested in them, where they're being sold. Right now, this information is not clear, and it's very hard to even work towards any type of regulatory environment without that kind of information. And most of us, to be quite frank, in the Palestinian context, have too high of a risk to be able to conduct a lot of that work directly. So we really do count on the support of the international community and of international researchers and of investigative journalists, who also are hit really hard in the time of COVID, and researchers, to be able to put together this picture and to be able to develop a way forward. But I think, you know, in a lot of the work that we do, we're often a bit too late as a community of activists, and it's really a shame, I have to admit, that after so many years we still don't know this basic information about the technologies and the actors. It's still not available. So I really think we have to get that done. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for that call for collective global research on the actors that we are struggling against and the Israeli role within the digital world. I would just want to ask Sally a short question on how do you think networks like the JustNet coalitions or others can effectively engage or be engaged within that work that organizations like Hamle or others are doing? How can we, as Palestine activists, ensure that we can build a better connection together with you and support your struggles?
Well, the JustNet coalition is a global coalition for just an equitable internet. It's been working for 4 or 5 years. It intervenes at the level of the global internet discussions, internet governance discussions, but has also realized that that's not enough, because that's a very limited space where you can have very little influence. So recently it's been working more on making connections precisely with social movements at different levels, rural organizations, workers organizations, women's organizations, and so on, to seek agreements on some fundamental issues that we need to act on to build a people's internet. We identify the fundamental contradiction between the corporate internet model that I described earlier and Prabir described, and the people's internet, one that belongs to people, to the citizens of the world. And one of the central proposals, which Prabir did mention, that JMC is working on, is data ownership. Because, as I mentioned in passing, the data economy isn't really in the global debate, even at the level of governments. In particular, data is left as being invisible, and data is the gold, the oil, the main input that builds wealth for these global corporations. And beyond just privacy issues, JNC's proposal, and we have a manifesto on this, is that data by default, if it's intimate data, should belong to the individual, and if it's collective data, which much of the data we have is, it should belong to the community. And this could mean all kinds of different communities, from a physical local community to a community of people working in a particular field. For example, Uber drivers who generate data all the time, but it doesn't belong to them. And that we need to build legislation around this. In India, they're working already on proposals for legislation around this. It's not going to be easy anywhere, but there are countries that are interested in considering it. And I think this is one of the things we need to start claiming and working around, how we can demand that data by the default doesn't belong to the company that collects it, but to whoever generates it.
Thanks a lot. And the last question is to Norman. And the question is really about how normalized do we have those relations between the US and Palestine, the US and Israel, and those kind of relations between the big corporates and repressive apartheid regimes or repressive regimes in general, and how can we try to work effectively to denormalize and cut them?
Yeah, I think there's, that's a really interesting question, because I think there's some parallel pieces. When it comes to the majority of big tech companies, there is a continued movement to opening up offices in Israel. So you're starting to see like Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Intel, a lot of different companies are based in Israel on the because of Israel's reputation for sort of tech and startups. And then even at the level of some of these technology companies within more of the we'll say security realm, there's a little bit of overlap, but I tend to think the US has some of its own companies that does its own things. Israel tends to be much more, I tend to think like NSO Group and others that build this sort of government spyware or tools for law enforcement tend to be more focused outside of the US. They do have conversations with US law enforcement, but what we see instead is that the US will go to US companies. There's folks like Lockheed Martin, where Walmart actually had hired Lockheed Martin to spy on employee organizers, for example. So some of this is like the US has their own companies, but there are areas where companies like Celebrite, for example, are sort of de facto used as in the US even, and not necessarily their mobile forensics tool, which is what became very famous with the FBI San Bernardino Apple case, where they used that to get access to a phone. But when it comes to Celebrite's larger tools around doing these sorts of investigations and responding to incidents and cyber incidents for corporations, those are seen as some of the best for corporations themselves. And then when you also have like antivirus and anti-malware companies, such as CrowdStrike, that are based in the US and in Israel. And you're seeing sort of even a bit more connection between those, where having this sort of diverse understanding and diverse offices are seen as a positive. So at the larger level of tech, I think that they're extremely intertwined, and it's very difficult to imagine we'll say trying to boycott some of these or trying to like separate out some of these connections just because of how interconnected these companies are, where their offices are, and these interactions. But there is possibility of pushing back and looking at things like regulations around certain types of technology. And and I shouldn't say just actually not even just at the regulation level, but also at the technical level. There, the antivirus and anti-malware companies can provide a very positive avenue to try and preemptively detect some of these tools. And there's been success at getting some of these tools able to be identified by antivirus, anti-malware, as well as sort of other spyware tools that are based towards, let's say, intimate partners that are sort of the same underlying technology that is what the NSO groups and these other companies. So there are ways of trying to look at protecting at a technical level, but it's still sort of this cat and mouse game with some of it from the perspective of like exploits that are found and these, we'll say mercenaries, these cyber mercenaries that exist. So it's part of a campaign internally in the US also around regulation and these companies, things like the breakup and monopolies, recognizing the value of data and these larger digital rights struggles that would, I think, make the most push towards sort of decoupling some of those connections that exist.
Thanks a lot. And I know there are other questions around there, and I think there is still lots to say and lots to discuss and lots to figure out, but time is running out. I've seen a lot of thank yous to the amazing speakers that are not coming only from me, but as well from the audience here. I've seen as well or received personally thank yous for the excellent translation to Spanish, and it's not easy to translate so specialized content. So a big applause for Eric and Izaskun that are with us. A big applause as well to Kepa and Sodepas that have helped us here in that webinar to be able to bring it to all and in both languages. And I really hope that that was only the first conversation that we have together and build together an effective struggle against digital walls and for Palestinian and digital rights and freedoms. And before I end this here, I just want to remind everybody that that was not the end as well, not only of that conversation, but as well not of the webinar series for a World Without Walls. We have immediately tomorrow a webinar scheduled in the framework of From the Ground Up, the Global Online Gathering for Climate Justice. That webinar is organized together with the COP26 Coalition and the Gastivists, and it is entitled Western Powers in the Middle East, Fueling Apartheid, Oppression, and Climate Change. Please join us. More you can find out on the Stop the Wall Facebook. On the 21st of November, we are having a webinar that I think is touching one of the walls that are hardly mentioned, but which are long and many, which are the Arab walls, the walls in the Arab world built by Arab countries, repression and division. And it will give a vision on the relations of walls, oppression, and normalization of Israeli apartheid. We will have speakers from Palestine, Western Sahara, and Kuwait. It'll be really interesting. Join us. It will be again in English, Spanish, and in addition in Arabic. And the last of the webinar series is on November 26th, Water, a Common Good or Privilege for the Few. And it's a seminar that looks at denial to access to water as another wall of injustice. We'll have speakers from India, Africa, and Latin America. So the webinars are going through the whole November, straight until November 29th, when we hopefully can give you a full overview of documentation and recordings of those webinars we've built up together with you. Thanks a lot, and I want to end it with a sentence dedicated to Worlds Without Walls by Friends of the Earth Brazil. The bigger the walls, the larger the cracks. Until the people keep standing, the walls will fall.